The sun was already low over the horizon when the carriage finally rattled to a stop in front of the sprawling ranch. Dust clung to the wheels and the leather harnesses, but more importantly, it clung to her nerves. She clutched the small trunk in her lap like it were a shield, every thump of the carriage wheels against the uneven road making her stomach twist tighter. This was it, the moment she had traded her entire life for, the new beginning that had been promised in letters and photographs. And yet, as the wooden gates creaked open, revealing the vast expanse of prairie and the wooden cabin that would be her new home, she found herself frozen in place. Her dark eyes scanned the yard, taking in the sprawling fields, the horses grazing nearby, and the figure that suddenly emerged from the shade of the barn. He was a man who seemed carved from the land itself, tall, broad-shouldered, with hair as dark as midnight and a face sharp enough to cut glass. His gaze swept over her with the casual precision of someone who had spent years reading the landscape, animals and people alike. "Miss." His voice was low, rough, and yet carried a strange, unyielding warmth. She swallowed and forced herself forward, stepping down from the carriage. Her feet felt heavy, like they belonged to someone else entirely. I'm here," she managed, her voice barely above a whisper. He nodded, and for a brief moment the air seemed to hold its breath. Then he reached out a hand, not in demand, but in guidance, and she found herself taking it, the warmth of his palm grounding her in the unfamiliar surroundings. The cabin door swung open, and she was ushered inside. The scent of wood smoke, leather, and something faintly sweet lingered in the air. It should have been comforting, but it only heightened the awareness of her own trembling body. She had imagined this moment 100 times in her mind, the ride across the prairie, the first sight of the man she had agreed to marry, the first night in a new home, but nothing had prepared her for the reality. He stood behind her, silent, as she set down her trunk. "I hope the ride wasn't too rough," he said finally, breaking the silence, though there was a weight in his tone that suggested he wasn't entirely concerned with politeness. "It's fine," she replied, her voice catching. "Thank you." She tried to meet his gaze, but the intensity in his dark eyes made her look away. Toward the small fire burning in the hearth dot, there was a moment of awkward silence, and then he cleared his throat. "I can show you your room." His words were simple, but the way he moved, deliberate, confident, made her heart race. As she followed him up the narrow staircase, her mind was a whirl of conflicting thoughts. She had been promised a husband who would care for her, protect her, and guide her. Yet the idea of sharing a life, let alone a bed, with this stranger made her chest tighten with fear. Her hands clenched the railing, knuckles white, as if gripping it could somehow anchor her in this moment of uncertainty. When the door to her room swung open, she stepped inside cautiously. The space was modest but clean, the small window letting in the last light of the setting sun. She set down her trunk and turned, only to find him standing in the doorway, watching her. Hi," she faltered, suddenly unsure of what to say, her cheeks flushing. He gave her a small, almost imperceptible nod. "You'll get used to it. All of it. And I'll make sure you do." His tone was firm, yet there was something in his gaze, a promise, or perhaps a warning that made her freeze completely. Freeze. That was the word that echoed in her mind. She had expected excitement, nervous anticipation, maybe even relief. But instead, her body betrayed her, and she stood there rigid, heart hammering, unsure if she wanted to flee or surrender to whatever was coming next. And that's when she realized this was only the beginning, and she had no idea what the cowboy had planned. The night settled over the ranch like a velvet blanket, and the only sounds were the low whinny of a horse and the occasional creak of the cabin settling in the cold air. She sat stiffly on the edge of her small bed, hands folded tightly in her lap, staring at the floor as if it could answer the whirlwind of thoughts in her mind. The day had been a blur of travel, introductions, and awkward silences. And now the solitude of her room made every worry stretch longer, every fear feel sharper. A soft knock at the door pulled her from her thoughts. "Come in," she whispered, her voice small. He stepped inside, removing his hat and letting the dim firelight catch on his rugged features. There was no smile this time, only an intense, steady gaze that made her pulse quicken without her consent. "I thought you might like some company," he said, his voice low and calm, yet carrying an undercurrent of something she couldn't quite name, something that made her stomach flutter nervously. "It's your first night here. Couldn't let you sit alone, could I?" She shook her head, suddenly unsure if she wanted him here. "I'm fine," she said, though the trembling in her hands betrayed her words. He moved closer, but slowly, giving her space. "You don't have to be." The way he said it, the softness in the middle of his commanding tone, made her look up, catching her gaze for just a fraction of a second before she looked away again. The air grew heavier between them, charged with unspoken words and unacknowledged desires. Then, as if drawn by some irresistible force, his hand reached out, brushing a loose strand of hair from her face. Her breath caught in her throat. It was just a simple touch, but it sent a jolt through her body, leaving her frozen in both fear and fascination. "Wait," she whispered, the single word barely audible. Her heart was hammering. He didn't move closer, didn't press her for an answer. Instead, he let his hand linger near her cheek, a silent question hanging in the air. She wanted to pull away, to flee from this strange, intense closeness. Yet every part of her mind, body, and soul was captivated, trembling at the thought of what might come next. "You don't have to do anything," he said finally, his voice a careful mixture of command and reassurance. "Not until you're ready." But even as he spoke, she could feel his presence pressing against her senses, the warmth of his body, the faint scent of leather and smoke, the quiet strength that radiated from him. Her mind was a battlefield of curiosity and caution. She wanted to trust him, to surrender to the feeling building inside her, yet fear held her rigid, as if any wrong move would shatter her fragile courage. I've never," she stammered, her cheeks flushing crimson. She couldn't even finish the thought. "Never what? Never been touched like this? Never trusted someone so quickly?" The words felt too fragile to speak aloud, too delicate to be heard. He leaned back slightly, giving her the space she needed, but his eyes never left hers. "I know," he said simply, and there was a weight to that single acknowledgement that made her chest tighten even more. "We'll take it slow. I'll show you everything you need to know. But it's your choice." Her lips parted, wanting to speak, to ask questions, to push away the fear clawing at her insides, but no sound came out. She was frozen, truly frozen, not out of defiance, but because her body and mind were caught between fear, excitement, and something she hadn't expected, desire. The cowboy's gaze softened ever so slightly, as if he understood the battle raging within her. Then, without another word, he stepped back and let the quiet settle in the room, giving her a moment to breathe, to think, to prepare herself for what he would ask or do next. And as she sat there, trembling and aware of every beat of her racing heart, she realized that the night was only just beginning. Her frozen hesitation was a barrier, yes, but one that he seemed determined to navigate with patience, skill, and a steady, undeniable presence. The night had deepened, and the fire in the hearth cast flickering shadows across the small room. She sat perched on the edge of the bed, hands folded tightly in her lap, heart still hammering from their earlier encounter. Every creak of the cabin, every whisper of wind against the window, felt magnified in the heavy silence. And yet, Despite her nerves, she couldn't help but glance toward the door, half expecting him to return. A soft knock echoed through the room. Her stomach flipped. "Come in," she whispered, barely moving. He stepped inside with the quiet confidence that seemed to follow him like a second skin. He didn't speak immediately, merely observed her with a steady, thoughtful gaze. There was something in the way he looked at her now, not as a stranger, not as a man claiming a bride, but as someone trying to understand her, to read the tension she carried like a fragile glass between them. "I thought maybe I could help you feel more comfortable," he said, his voice low and smooth. "If you want, I can show you a little about the ranch, the horses, the barn. It might help you feel at home." Her chest tightened at the thought of being near him, of moving through that space with him so close. Yet, despite the fear that bubbled inside her, a flicker of curiosity sparked. Slowly, hesitantly, she nodded. "Oh, okay," she whispered. He smiled faintly, the corners of his mouth just barely lifting, and gestured toward the door. "Then let's start slow. Just a walk around the cabin. Nothing more than that. You can tell me if it's too much." As they moved through the hallway, she kept her hands clasped in front of her, aware of the heat radiating from his body. Every step beside him was a test of self-control. She wanted to recoil, to run back to the safety of her room, but something in the steady rhythm of his stride, the calm assurance in his presence, made her hesitant to flee. When they reached the barn, he paused. "These are the horses," he said, voice soft now, as if sharing a secret. "You'll be spending a lot of time with them. They're gentle, but they respond to trust. Same as people." She stared at the animals, then back at him. There was a warmth in his expression that made her chest ache, a quiet patience that contrasted sharply with the raw intensity she had felt earlier. Slowly, she lifted her hands and ran a tentative finger along the nose of a gray mar. The horse nuzzled her gently, and she let out a small, surprised laugh. "There you go," he said quietly. "See? Trust isn't just something you give blindly. It's built slowly." Her eyes met his, and for a moment, the tension between them shifted. She could feel the heat of him near, the subtle brush of his presence against her awareness. He took a small step closer, not pressing, not demanding, just near enough that she could sense his attention on her. "Sometimes," he said softly, "people freeze because they're unsure what's coming next. But nothing will happen you're not ready for. Do you understand?" She nodded, words failing her. Her heart still raced, but the fear had softened slightly, replaced by a spark of trust she hadn't expected to feel so soon. Slowly, ever so carefully, he extended his hand, not to touch her forcibly, but to offer connection. Trembling, she reached out, letting her fingers brush his. The contact was electric, sending shivers up her spine, yet it was gentle, controlled. It was the first step in a dance neither of them had rehearsed, a delicate exchange of trust and desire. She felt her body responding despite her fear, the initial freeze beginning to melt under his steady, reassuring presence. For the first time since she arrived, she realized she wasn't completely paralyzed by the unknown. There was something in him, something patient, strong, and unyielding, that made her want to let go, even if just a little. And in that quiet moment, with the horses watching and the moonlight spilling across the barn floor, she understood a truth she couldn't yet speak aloud. The cowboy's approach wasn't just bold, it was a promise. And her frozen hesitation was no longer a barrier, but a bridge to something far more intense and inevitable. The days following her arrival passed in a slow, almost dreamlike rhythm. She learned the layout of the ranch, the names of the horses, and the routines that governed life here. And through it all, he was there, sometimes guiding her hands as she fed the animals, sometimes offering a quiet word of encouragement when she stumbled. Each encounter was small, seemingly insignificant, Yet it left a mark she couldn't ignore. Tonight, however, the air felt heavier, charged with a tension she could no longer deny. She had been in the cabin for hours, attempting to read by the fire, yet her mind kept wandering to him, his dark eyes, the warmth of his hand, the way he seemed to notice the tiniest tremor in her body. She realized with a sudden start that she had been thinking of him far more intimately than she cared to admit. A soft knock at the door broke her reverie. She held her breath. "Come in," she whispered, voice barely audible. He entered without hesitation, the familiar confidence radiating from him. But tonight there was a different energy, something subtle yet undeniable. He closed the door behind him and leaned against the frame, studying her with that same intense gaze that had become both thrilling and terrifying. "You've been practicing with the horses all day," he said softly. "You've done well." Thank you," she stammered, cheeks flushing. Her hands twisted nervously in her lap. Every word, every glance, seemed to carry an undercurrent she couldn't yet name. He stepped closer, slow and deliberate, giving her space but closing the gap enough that she could feel the heat radiating from him. "You're different from what I expected," he said, his voice low, almost a whisper. "I didn't know someone could be so careful, so precise. Yet there's something underneath it." She felt her breath catch, unsure if he was speaking about her nerves, her hesitation, or the way her body reacted to him. I just... She began, only to falter under the weight of his stare. He said, lifting a hand in a gesture of calm. "No need to explain. I can see it. The hesitation, the fear, but also the curiosity, the want that you won't say aloud." Her heart hammered. His words, soft yet charged with intention, made her body respond despite herself. She froze, unsure how to act, torn between retreating and leaning into the magnetic pull of his presence. He took another small step, letting his fingers lightly brush hers as he passed. The contact was fleeting, yet it sent shivers racing up her arm. Her knees trembled, her chest tightening in a way that made it almost impossible to breathe normally. "You don't have to move faster than you want," he said quietly. "Every step, every touch. It's yours to accept. I'll wait, I promise. But I need you to know," he paused, letting the tension hang in the air, "that I won't let fear keep you from experiencing what you need to feel." She looked up at him, eyes wide, cheeks flushed. I don't know if I'm ready," she admitted, voice small and shaky. "You're closer than you think," he murmured, his hand lightly grazing her shoulder. Not pressing, not demanding, only offering connection. Sometimes the first step isn't about bravery. It's about trust. And I can see you're starting to trust me. For a long moment, they simply stood there, the firelight casting flickering shadows across the room. Her body remained frozen, yet the tension within it had begun to loosen slightly. She could feel the pull between them growing stronger, the unspoken desire simmering beneath the surface, and though she was still hesitant, still unsure, a small spark of courage ignited. For the first time, she realized that her frozen state wasn't permanent. With patience, with guidance, with the gentle but undeniable presence of the cowboy, she might just be able to step into the unknown and discover something far more intense than fear alone. The night stretched on, full of unspoken promises, quiet breaths, and the subtle, electric tension of two hearts cautiously inching closer. And in that space, she understood that the path ahead, though uncertain, was theirs to explore together. The next morning, the ranch was bathed in soft sunlight, casting golden light across the dusty fields and wooden fences. She rose early, her body still humming with the echoes of last night's tension. Every movement felt heavier, every thought shadowed by the awareness of him, the cowboy who had unsettled her in ways she hadn't anticipated. and who now lingered in her mind with a persistent pull she couldn't resist. She went about her chores with meticulous care, feeding the horses and brushing the animals. Yet she could feel his presence even when he wasn't there. The memory of his touch, light but purposeful, sent tremors through her spine. Every brush of her hand across the horse's mane seemed to echo his earlier guidance. Every careful motion a reminder of the quiet intensity between them. By midday, he appeared, leaning casually against the barn doorway, watching her with that same piercing gaze that both unnerved and enthralled her. He made no immediate move, simply observing, allowing her to feel his presence before he spoke. "You're improving," he said softly, his voice carrying over the hum of the horses. "Faster than I expected." She blinked, startled, her cheeks warming. I'm trying," she murmured, almost embarrassed at her own eagerness to please. He stepped closer, slow and deliberate, leaving just enough space between them for her to breathe. "It's not about perfection," he said. "It's about learning, about paying attention and letting yourself trust the process. Trust me." Her heart skipped a beat. His words were gentle, yet the depth of their meaning sent a thrill through her. She wanted to step back, to flee from the intensity of the moment. Yet every fiber of her being urged her forward, curious about the sensations stirring within her. Then, almost imperceptibly, he reached out and brushed a stray lock of hair from her face. The contact was fleeting, but it sent shivers through her, making her hands tremble and her breath hitch. She froze, caught between fear and the growing, undeniable desire that her body refused to ignore. She began, but the words faltered as his hand lingered near her cheek, his thumb tracing a gentle line along her jaw. She could feel the warmth of him, the careful control in every movement. He murmured softly, his eyes locking with hers. "No need to speak. Just feel. You'll know when you're ready to move further. And when that happens, I'll be here." Her breath came faster. The tension that had held her frozen was beginning to melt, replaced by something more intoxicating curiosity, trust, and an awakening desire she hadn't anticipated. She realized that fear no longer ruled her. It was a fragile thread, giving way to the spark of connection between them. He leaned back slightly, letting her process, giving her the space to adjust, but the magnetic pull remained. Every glance, every subtle movement was a lesson in patience and desire. She could feel her body responding, the initial freeze of fear slowly giving way to a warmth that surprised her, leaving her heart racing and her senses heightened. "You're doing well," he said again, softer this time, almost like a private encouragement meant only for her. "Let yourself feel. Don't fight it. It's part of learning, part of trusting me." Her lips parted, and she finally managed a small, breathless nod. Her hands still shook, but she was no longer paralyzed. She could feel the first real stirrings of desire, of anticipation, building inside her, coaxed gently by his presence. For the first time, she understood the delicate balance between fear and trust, between hesitation and longing. And in that quiet, sunlit barn, surrounded by horses and the vast open prairie, she realized something remarkable. Her frozen state was fading. Step by step, touch by touch, the cowboy was guiding her toward a place where fear no longer dictated her body, where desire, connection, and tentative intimacy could finally flourish, and in that moment, she knew this was only the beginning. The evening settled over the ranch like a soft blanket, cooling the sun-baked earth and painting the sky in shades of orange and violet. She had spent the day helping him with chores, gathering firewood, feeding the animals, and tending to the small garden near the cabin, but her thoughts were never far from him. Every glance he gave, every word he spoke, lingered in her mind, stirring feelings she still didn't fully understand. As night fell, she found herself in the cabin, attempting to focus on simple tasks, folding laundry, tidying her small space, but each movement reminded her of their closeness earlier. Her chest tightened in a mixture of anticipation and nerves. She was aware now, more than ever, of the tension that had been building between them for days. A gentle knock at the door startled her. "Come in," she whispered, her voice a mix of caution and hope. He stepped inside, removing his hat and letting the dim firelight illuminate his strong features. He moved closer, slow and deliberate, his presence filling the small room without a word. She could feel the warmth radiating from him, the subtle strength of his body, and the magnetic pull that made her pulse race. "You've been working hard today," he said softly. "I thought you might like some company while you relax." Her lips parted, but no words came out. She could only nod, feeling her heart thumping in her chest. She wanted to retreat, to flee from the intensity of the moment. Yet she couldn't. Every fiber of her being was drawn to him. He settled near her, not pressing, not demanding, simply close enough that she could sense his presence. The firelight danced across his features, highlighting the subtle strength in his jaw and the intensity of his gaze. For a long moment, neither spoke, and the quiet between them was charged with something neither of them could name. Finally, he reached out, brushing a strand of hair from her face. The touch was gentle, deliberate, and it sent shivers racing up her spine. She froze, aware of every nerve ending in her body, caught between fear and desire. "I can feel it," he said quietly, his voice low and reassuring. The hesitation, the tension, but also the curiosity. You want to, even if your fear makes you pause. Her breath caught. He could see it, see the storm inside her, and instead of exploiting it, he respected it. That thought alone made her chest ache with a mix of vulnerability and longing. "You don't have to do anything you're not ready for," he continued, his hand hovering near hers, not touching yet. "Every step we take together is yours to control. But I need you to know, I won't rush you. I'll wait. And I'll guide you only as far as you're willing to go." Her lips parted in a small, breathless gasp. The truth of his words resonated deep inside her. She could feel herself beginning to trust him, not just with her safety, but with something far more intimate, her body, her feelings, her desires. Slowly, ever so carefully, she extended her hand toward his. Their fingers brushed, tentative and shy, yet electric. That fleeting contact was enough to dissolve the last lingering tension, leaving her body humming with awareness. He smiled faintly, encouragingly, without breaking the intensity of their connection. "There," he whispered. "See, you're learning. You can trust yourself." And me. Her heart raced, and for the first time, she realized that fear was no longer her master. Curiosity, trust, and desire were taking root, growing stronger with each deliberate, careful touch. She still trembled, still hesitated, but she was no longer frozen. The first walls had begun to crumble, and she felt a spark of courage that she hadn't known she possessed. As the night deepened, the fire flickered, casting shadows that danced across the cabin walls. And in that quiet, intimate space, she understood something she hadn't before. This was only the beginning. Step by step, touch by touch, he was guiding her towards something more intense, more thrilling, and far more intimate than she had ever imagined. For the first time, she didn't just fear the unknown. She longed for it. The fire had dwindled to glowing embers, casting a soft, warm light across the small cabin. Outside, the prairie lay quiet, the wind whispering through the grass like a gentle lullaby. She sat on the edge of the bed, hands trembling slightly in her lap, heart racing. The tension that had been building between them for days, the subtle touches, the lingering gazes, the quiet moments of connection had reached a point she could no longer ignore. A knock at the door startled her, though she almost expected it. "Come in," she whispered, her voice shaky but carrying a hint of anticipation. He entered, his eyes immediately finding hers. There was a gravity in his gaze tonight, an intensity that made her chest tighten. He didn't speak at first, merely stepped closer, letting the space between them shrink until the warmth of his presence was undeniable. "You've been holding back," he said softly. Almost a whisper, yet it carried across the quiet room. "I can feel it, every hesitation, every question in your mind. But I also feel your trust, your curiosity." Her cheeks burned, and she lowered her gaze, unable to meet the intensity in his dark eyes. I'm not sure," she whispered. Her voice trailed off, unable to fully articulate the storm of emotions inside her: fear, desire, embarrassment, and a growing longing she had never known before. He reached out, gently lifting her chin with his fingers. The touch was deliberate, tender, and commanding all at once. She froze, breath hitching, her body betraying her resolve. His thumb traced a line along her cheek, and for the first time, she allowed herself to truly feel the heat of his presence. He murmured, "You don't have to do anything you're not ready for. But I need you to know something." His gaze softened just enough to make her chest ache. "I won't let fear keep you from experiencing this. Every step we take, it will be slow, careful, and guided. But I want you to feel everything, your curiosity, your desire, everything you've been holding back." Her lips parted, and she let out a small, shaky breath. Her body was still tense, trembling slightly, but the walls she had built around herself were starting to crumble. She wanted to resist, to retreat to safety, yet every fiber of her being was drawn to him. He leaned in, so close that she could feel his warm breath against her skin. His hand moved slowly, deliberately, tracing a path from her shoulder down her arm, every touch calculated to elicit response without overwhelming her. She shivered under his touch, caught between fear and a growing, undeniable desire. "Trust me," he whispered again, his lips barely brushing her ear. "I'll guide you. I'll be patient. But you have to let yourself feel." A soft moan escaped her lips, involuntary, and she pressed closer to the heat of his body, letting the tension inside her start to dissolve. He responded by cupping her face, drawing her gaze back to his, giving her the courage to meet his eyes fully. There was no rush, no force, only the careful, deliberate presence of someone who understood the fragility of trust and the intensity of desire. Slowly, hesitantly, she allowed him to draw closer, their bodies nearly touching now, the warmth between them undeniable. Her frozen hesitation, the fear that had gripped her for so long, began to give way to trust, to curiosity, and to the first spark of pleasure she had not anticipated. She let her hands rest on his chest, feeling the strength beneath the fabric, the steady beat of his heart. "See?" he murmured softly, resting his forehead against hers. "You're ready. You just needed to know it was safe to let go." Her pulse raced, and for the first time since her arrival, she felt free to explore the desires she had tried to deny. The fear still lingered, but it had become part of something greater, a connection, an intimacy that went beyond physical touch. It was emotional, powerful, and utterly consuming. And as the firelight flickered, casting dancing shadows across the cabin walls, she truly realized that she was no longer frozen. She was ready to take the next step. Guided by the cowboy who had slowly, patiently awakened something inside her she could no longer resist, the cabin was quiet, save for the soft crackle of the fire in the hearth. Shadows danced across the walls, moving with the rhythm of the flames, and outside, the prairie stretched endlessly under the silver light of the moon. She sat on the edge of the bed, heart pounding, awareness sharpened to every sensation, the warmth of the room, the lingering scent of leather and smoke, and the steady, magnetic presence of the cowboy standing before her. He stepped closer, slow and deliberate, giving her every chance to retreat, every chance to hesitate. But she didn't move back. Something inside her had shifted in the past few days, in the hours of small touches, quiet words, and moments of shared understanding. She realized now that fear no longer had complete control. Curiosity and desire had begun to take its place. "You're ready," he murmured, his voice low, reassuring, and charged with intent. "I can feel it. You want this, even if you're still unsure." Her lips parted in a small, breathless nod. She felt a shiver run through her. But this time it wasn't entirely fear, it was anticipation, excitement, and a growing sense of trust that allowed her to lean into him rather than away. He extended a hand, brushing his fingers against hers. The contact was electric yet gentle, deliberate, meant to guide rather than push. She let him lead, standing slowly as he offered her support. The distance between them closed, their bodies now only inches apart. She could feel the heat radiating from him, the steady strength beneath his exterior, and the quiet patience that had been his constant companion. "Every step is yours," he whispered. "I'll follow your lead. Just let yourself feel." Her hands moved to rest on his chest, tentative at first, then with growing confidence. She felt his heartbeat beneath her fingers, steady and strong, and it anchored her in the moment. The frozen hesitation that had gripped her for so long melted away, replaced by trust and a budding, thrilling desire that she no longer tried to deny. He lowered his head slowly, giving her space to adjust, to signal if she wanted him closer. She didn't pull away. Instead, she leaned in slightly, her lips barely brushing his, testing, exploring. The connection was electric, a spark igniting that had been building for days. His hands traced her arms, her shoulders, always careful, always attentive to her responses. "Good," he murmured against her lips. "You're doing perfectly." Her body responded, every nerve ending alight, every sense focused on him. The fear that had once frozen her was now a memory, replaced by a trust that allowed her to embrace each sensation, each gentle touch. With a mix of awe and desire, they moved together slowly, deliberately, exploring the intimacy that had been teased and restrained for so long. There was no rush, only the patient, careful guidance of someone who understood that the most profound moments of connection are built on trust, not haste. She felt her confidence grow with every movement, every soft caress, and every whispered word. As their bodies pressed closer, the cabin seemed to disappear around them. There was only the heat between them, the soft rhythm of their breaths, and the unspoken bond that had formed over days of quiet tension, hesitant touches, and careful trust. She let herself surrender, fully, for the first time in this new life, allowing him to guide her, comfort her, and awaken sensations she had never known. When it was over, they remained close, foreheads pressed together, breaths mingling in the quiet warmth of the room. She felt a soft flush of embarrassment, mingled with relief and exhilaration. "You were incredible," he whispered softly, his hand brushing a strand of hair from her face. "And you trusted yourself. And me. That's what matters most." She smiled faintly, her chest still racing, yet filled with a new, undeniable confidence. For the first time since she had arrived at this remote ranch, she felt whole, vulnerable yet empowered, frightened yet exhilarated, and deeply connected to the cowboy who had guided her so patiently, so carefully, into this new, intoxicating world. And in that quiet cabin, under the soft glow of firelight and moonlight, she realized that the beginning of their journey was only just unfolding, and that together they had discovered something far more intense and unforgettable than either of them could have imagined.